A Christmas Carol, a story of redemption and grace reclaimed. Prologue, Charles Dickens. A Christmas Carol is often celebrated as a heartwarming Christmas classic, a tale filled with family gatherings, festive meals, and the joy of giving. For many, the story of Ebenezer Scrooge has become synonymous with the holiday season, evoking images of snow-covered streets, Christmas trees, and acts of generosity. But beyond the seasonal traditions, the true heart of this story runs much deeper. At its core, A Christmas Carol is not merely a celebration of holiday cheer, but a profound reflection on the Christian message of redemption. It is the story of a man trapped in the darkness of his own heart, consumed by greed and self-interest, who is given a second chance, a moment of grace to embrace transformation. And yet, as we journey through this retelling, I invite you to ask yourself, where am I in this story? Have you ever felt trapped by the weight of your own choices or distant from the love and grace of God? Like Scrooge, we are all offered the gift of a second chance. Will we accept it? Dickens, though often remembered for his vivid characters and social critiques, was deeply influenced by Christian values. In A Christmas Carol, his aim was not just to entertain but to invite reflection on the true meaning of Christmas. The birth of Christ is the turning point of human history, where heaven met earth and hope was born. Christ's coming is not merely an annual celebration, it is the foundation of our salvation. Similarly, Scrooge's journey reflects our own potential for transformation when we encounter grace. This modern retelling of A Christmas Carol seeks to reclaim and highlight the original Christian message that Dickens subtly wove throughout his narrative. As Scrooge journeys through the past, present and future, we are reminded of the redeeming power of love and the profound change that comes when we open our hearts to the truth. Scrooge's transformation mirrors the greater story of God's love for us, a love so powerful that he sent his only Son to rescue us from our own selfishness and offer eternal life. As you read this retelling, I invite you to see beyond the familiar tale of a miser's change of heart and reflect on the deeper meaning of redemption. Let it remind you of the true message of Christmas, that God through Christ offers salvation to all who are willing to receive it. Just as Scrooge's heart was softened by grace, so too are we invited to experience the life-changing power of God's love. This story is not just about personal transformation, but points to the greater narrative of the gospel, God's redemptive plan for the world. As you journey through these pages, may you be reminded of the greatest gift of all, the gift of salvation through the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. This Christmas season, let us not only celebrate the joy of giving, but also return to the ultimate giver, God Himself, who gave us His Son so that we might be renewed, transformed, and redeemed. Chapter 1. A Cold, Cold Heart. It's Christmas Eve in London, and while the city bustles with joy and anticipation, one man remains untouched by the season, Ebenezer Scrooge. Scrooge was not just a miser, he was a man who had built walls around his heart. Every Christmas season, while the world outside celebrated with love and joy, Scrooge remained in his cold office, counting his coins and calculating his profits. The warmth of the holiday season never reached him. "Bah! Humbug!" Scrooge muttered, dismissing any mention of Christmas. To him, the season was nothing more than a waste of time and money. The door to his office creaked open, and in walked his nephew, Fred. Fred's face glowed with cheer and excitement as he greeted his uncle. "Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" But Scrooge's response was as cold as the winter air outside. "Christmas? Humbug!" he replied sharply. "What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." Fred, ever hopeful, smiled kindly at his uncle. "Christmas is a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable time, Uncle. It's a time to celebrate life, to be with family, to share joy with others. Scrooge scoffed at the idea, his eyes narrowing. What right have you to be happy? What good has Christmas ever done for you? Fred paused for a moment, his smile softening, but his heart remained full of hope. Christmas has done me much good, Uncle. It reminds me of all that's good in the world, and though you don't share my views, I will always wish you joy and peace. Fred's words lingered in the air, but Scrooge would not let them touch him. Bah! Humbug! He muttered again, turning back to his work. Fred's invitation to Christmas dinner was swiftly rejected, as Scrooge dismissed the very idea of spending time with family. Scrooge's coldness toward Fred reveals a man who had shut himself off from the world and from love. His heart, once capable of warmth, had grown hard with years of greed and bitterness. Like many today, Scrooge was so consumed by his material pursuits that he had forgotten the deeper spiritual richness of life. As Proverbs 27:19 reminds us, as water reflects the face, so one's life reflects the heart. Scrooge's life reflected the darkness in his heart, but even here there was still a glimmer of hope. Chapter 2. An Invitation Rejected. Fred stood in Scrooge's dimly lit office, his heart full of the joy and warmth that Christmas always brought. Despite his uncle's gruff exterior, Fred had never stopped believing that there was good in him, buried deep beneath the layers of bitterness. "Uncle Scrooge," Fred said warmly, "I've come to invite you to Christmas dinner. Please join us tomorrow." Scrooge barely looked up from his ledger. "Dinner? With your family? Humbug!" He shook his head dismissively. "I see no reason to celebrate. Christmas is nothing but an excuse for people to avoid work and waste money on frivolities." Fred's smile faded slightly, but his resolve remained strong. "You're missing the point of Christmas, Uncle. It's not about money or work. It's about love, joy, and togetherness." Scrooge finally looked up, his expression cold. "What right do you have to preach to me about joy? You're not rich. You've never had money to your name. What good has Christmas ever done for you?" Fred paused for a moment, his eyes soft with understanding. "Christmas has done me a world of good, Uncle. It has made me appreciate what I have, no matter how little. I see love and laughter in the faces of my family, and that's more valuable than any fortune." Scrooge's gaze hardened. "Love and laughter won't pay the bills, Fred. You waste your time on such sentiments." But Fred, though rejected again, refused to let Scrooge's words discourage him. "I'll continue to wish you joy, Uncle. One day, I hope you'll see what you've been missing." With that, Fred turned to leave, his heart still filled with hope despite his uncle's coldness. He had extended the invitation in love, and though Scrooge rejected it, Fred's compassion for his uncle remained unchanged. Fred's gentle persistence mirrors the grace that Christ extends to each of us. Though Scrooge turned away from love and joy, Fred's open heart never wavered. As 1 John 4:19 reminds us, "We love because he first loved us." Fred's love for Scrooge was a reflection of the deeper love that God has for each of us, even when we reject him. Chapter 3. A Closed Hand. The streets of London bustled with the sounds of Christmas, the clatter of carriages, the murmur of shoppers, and the faint echo of carolers singing beneath glowing lamplights. But inside Ebenezer Scrooge's office, the noise was barely noticed. He was too focused on the numbers, counting every penny and watching over his wealth like a miser guarding treasure. Suddenly the door creaked open, and two well-dressed gentlemen entered, their faces full of goodwill. They approached Scrooge with a cheerful air, though they hesitated at the coldness that surrounded him. "Mr. Scrooge," one began, "we are collecting donations for the poor. Many are in need of basic provisions this Christmas: food, warmth, and shelter. We are asking those who are blessed with abundance to spare a little for those who have none." Scrooge didn't even look up, his quill scratched across the page, tallying up figures, as though the request had fallen on deaf ears. Finally, with a sharp tone, he replied, "Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?" The two men exchanged uneasy glances. Many would rather die than go to those places, one explained softly. If they would rather die, Scrooge said without emotion, then they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. With that, the gentlemen, stunned and saddened, quickly left the office, their hopes for generosity dashed. Scrooge's hand remained tightly closed, unwilling to part with even a single coin to ease the suffering of others. The door closed behind the two men, their hopes for generosity dashed. Scrooge returned to his ledger, indifferent to their pleas. But in the quiet that followed, a strange emptiness crept into the room, as though something vital had been locked out along with the cold air. His heart, like his hand, had closed itself to compassion. "Whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me," Scripture warns, Matthew 25:40. But in this moment Scrooge's heart remained hard, yet even the most tightly clenched hand can, in time, be opened. Chapter 4. Cratchit's Christmas Wish. The clock on the wall ticked slowly toward the end of the workday, but for Bob Cratchit each minute felt like an hour. He sat at his small desk, bundled in a threadbare coat, trying to stay warm by the faint embers of a nearly dead fire. Scrooge, his employer, had seen no need to waste coal on keeping the office warm. After all, to Scrooge, warmth was just another expense. As the day wore on and the cold deepened, Bob gathered the courage to speak. His voice, though gentle, trembled with both the chill in the air and the weight of his request. "Mr. Scrooge," he began, his hands trembling as he removed his hat, "I was hoping to ask for Christmas Day off, if it wouldn't be too much trouble." Scrooge's eyes narrowed as he looked up from his ledger. "Christmas? A whole day off for Christmas?" he grumbled, shaking his head in disbelief. To Scrooge, this was an absurd request. After all, why should the work stop for a single holiday? "It's only once a year, sir," Bob replied softly, standing there with a nervous smile, hoping that Scrooge's heart might warm, even if just for a moment. Scrooge leaned back in his chair, calculating the loss of productivity in his mind. "A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December, he muttered. But after a long pause, he waved his hand dismissively. "Fine, but be here all the earlier the next day." Bob smiled gratefully, tipping his hat as he left the office. For him, it wasn't just about the time off. It was about being with his family, sharing in the simple joys that money could never buy. Despite Scrooge's cold response, Bob left the office with a sense of hope in his heart, wishing his employer well as he stepped out into the snowy evening. Bob Cratchit's humble request for Christmas Day off reflects a longing for what truly matters: time with loved ones, joy and togetherness. While Scrooge saw only lost profit, Bob saw the gift of presence, a reminder that sometimes the most valuable things in life cannot be measured in wealth. As Jesus teaches in Luke 12:15, life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. Bob's contentment stands in contrast to Scrooge's relentless pursuit of wealth, but soon Scrooge will learn that love and joy cannot be bought. They are gifts. Chapter 5. The Ghost of Marley Appears. The night had fallen heavy over London, and Ebenezer Scrooge, now alone in his cold, dimly lit house, sat by a meagre fire. The ticking of the clock echoed through the empty rooms, a reminder of the passing time, though to Scrooge it seemed as lifeless as the fire barely flickering in the hearth. He stirred his thin gruel absent-mindedly, thinking little of anything beyond the comfort of his bed, but as he prepared to retire, something strange happened. At first, it was just a faint clanking sound, distant, like chains being dragged along a stone floor. Then louder. It echoed through the hallways, creeping closer. Scrooge's heart quickened as the sound grew nearer, a chill creeping down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Suddenly, before him appeared the ghostly figure of Jacob Marley, Scrooge's old business partner, long dead and buried. But this was not the Marley that Scrooge remembered. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, and he was bound by heavy chains, wrapped tightly around his body, clinking with every step. "Ebenezer Scrooge," Marley's ghost moaned, his voice hollow and filled with sorrow. "I have come to warn you." Scrooge, though shaken, could hardly believe his eyes. "Humbug," he whispered under his breath, trying to convince himself it was nothing more than a dream. But Marley persisted. "These chains I bear were forged in life by my own greed and selfishness, Ebenezer, and you are forging your own chains, link by link, with every miserly act." Marley's chains were not merely physical. They were forged link by link with each act of selfishness, each cold-hearted choice made during his lifetime. His torment now was a reflection of his soul's captivity, bound forever by the weight of the life he had lived. Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows, Scripture warns, Galatians 6:7. Marley had reaped sorrow and eternal regret. But Scrooge, standing at the crossroads of life and death, was offered something that Marley had not been: grace. "You have a chance," Marley whispered. "A gift you cannot earn, but only accept. Do not let it slip away." Chapter 6. The First Spirit. The house was still, yet Scrooge couldn't sleep. His mind raced with the memory of Jacob Marley's ghost and the terrifying warning that had been given. Marley's chains, his hollow voice, the dread in his words, these haunted Scrooge even more than the cold, empty darkness of his room. Suddenly, a strange light appeared at the foot of his bed, softly glowing, illuminating the room in an otherworldly hue. Scrooge's breath caught in his throat as a figure emerged from the light. It was a spirit, small yet radiant, its form shifting between that of a child and an old man. The spirit's eyes were kind, though they seemed to see straight through Scrooge, gazing not only at the man before him, but at the life that lay behind. "I am the ghost of Christmas past," the spirit said, its voice both gentle and firm, like the ringing of a distant bell. "Rise and walk with me." Scrooge, though shaken, followed the spirit's command, and in the blink of an eye they were no longer in his room. Instead, they stood in the open countryside, with snow softly falling around them. Scrooge's eyes widened as he looked around, recognizing the scene before him. It was the village where he had grown up. He saw children laughing and playing in the snow, their faces bright with the joy of Christmas. Among them, Scrooge noticed a younger version of himself, alone by the schoolhouse, looking on wistfully at the other children. His heart ached at the sight of his boyhood loneliness, a feeling he had long buried. "These are shadows of the things that have been," the spirit said quietly. "You were left here, forgotten, while others celebrated. But even then, there was hope." The scene shifted again. Now Scrooge was a young man, full of energy and ambition, working long hours in a busy office. He saw his former fiancée, Belle, standing by his side. They were happy once, filled with the hope of a future together. But then slowly he saw the love between them fade, overshadowed by his growing obsession with wealth. Belle's face grew sad, and soon she walked away, leaving the younger Scrooge alone, clutching his work, his only comfort. "You chose your path, Ebenezer," the spirit whispered as the scene faded once more. "But all is not lost. There is still time." In these memories, Scrooge was forced to confront the choices that shaped his life, the moments where he chose wealth over love, ambition over relationships. Yet even in these painful memories, the Spirit reminds Scrooge and us that there is still hope. As Psalm 90:12 teaches, "Teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom." Scrooge is learning this wisdom now, though it comes with the painful realization of what he has lost. Chapter 7. Lonely Christmases. The snow fell gently around them, but Scrooge could hardly feel its chill. His mind was too occupied by the scenes unfolding before him, echoes of a life long past. The ghost of Christmas. Past stood silently by his side, its light casting long shadows on the memories they now relived together. They had returned to the village of Scrooge's youth, but this time the scene was different. It was the inside of a small schoolhouse, empty except for a lone boy seated at a desk by the window, staring out at the snow-covered grounds. Scrooge knew that boy well. It was himself, years younger, left behind while others had gone home to be with their families for Christmas. Scrooge's heart ached at the sight of his younger self, isolated and forgotten. "I was alone," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They all went home, and I was left here, alone." The spirit nodded softly, allowing the scene to unfold. The boy sat in silence, his only company the faint sounds of Christmas songs drifting in from the village. There was no joy for him, only the growing bitterness that would harden his heart over the years. "There was a time," the spirit said quietly, "when you longed for love and companionship, when your heart was still open to the joy of Christmas. But each lonely Christmas forged another link in the chain that binds you now." The scene shifted again. This time, Scrooge saw himself as a young man, still filled with potential but slowly consumed by his growing ambition. He saw the early years of his career, when he worked tirelessly, determined to succeed, to never feel the helplessness he had known as a boy. And yet, in his pursuit of security, he pushed away the very things that brought warmth to life. Among those memories was Belle. Scrooge saw her again, the woman he once loved, and the ache in his chest deepened as he remembered how their relationship had dissolved, how she had left him when it became clear that he loved money more than her. "Do you see now, Ebenezer?" the spirit asked. "You were not always this man. The seeds of your bitterness were planted long ago, but they have grown because you watered them with greed and fear." Scrooge lowered his head, his heart heavy with the weight of regret. He had chosen this path, and now he saw the cost. In these moments, Scrooge's loneliness becomes more than just a memory. It becomes a mirror for the choices we make in our own lives. His decision to prioritize wealth over relationships created a life of isolation, a life void of love. But even here, as Scrooge reflects on his past, there is a glimmer of hope. As Proverbs 19:22 reminds us, "What a person desires is unfailing love. Better to be poor than a liar." Scrooge is learning that wealth is not the answer, and there is still time to pursue what truly matters. Chapter 8. The Love That Faded. The light of the Ghost of Christmas Past glowed softly, illuminating the next scene in Scrooge's journey through time. This time, they found themselves in a small, cosy room. A fire crackled warmly in the hearth, casting a gentle glow over two figures seated on a simple, well-worn couch. One of them was Scrooge, a younger man with ambition shining in his eyes. The other was Belle, the woman he had once loved. Scrooge recognized the moment immediately. How could he forget? Belle was speaking, her voice soft, but there was sadness in her eyes that Scrooge hadn't seen, or perhaps refused to see, all those years ago. "You have changed, Ebenezer," she said quietly. "Another idol has replaced me, a golden one." Scrooge stood silently beside the spirit, watching as his younger self sat rigid, unable to meet Belle's gaze. He remembered this conversation, the one where Belle had gently told him that their love had faded, not because of time, but because his heart had grown cold, consumed by his obsession with wealth. "I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off, one by one," Belle continued, her voice steady, though filled with pain, "until the master passion gain engrosses you." Younger Scrooge had protested then, insisting that he was only being prudent, preparing for the future. But Belle, with wisdom beyond her years, had seen the truth. She saw that his love for money had outgrown his love for her, and that whatever warmth remained between them had long since been replaced by the cold calculations of a man determined to secure his fortune. "May you be happy in the life you have chosen," Belle had said at the end, her voice breaking just slightly. And with that, she had walked away, leaving behind the young man who had, in his pursuit of wealth, let love slip through his fingers. Now, as the spirit stood beside him, Scrooge's heart ached. He had been blind to it then, but seeing it now with fresh eyes, he realized the weight of what he had lost. In this pivotal moment, Scrooge is forced to confront the cost of his choices. His pursuit of wealth has led him to lose something far greater: love. Just as Belle saw through the facade of his ambition, we are reminded of Christ's words in Matthew 6:24. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Scrooge's heart had chosen a master, but it was a choice that cost him everything. Chapter 9. Fred's Unwavering Hope. The ghost of Christmas past had shown Scrooge the painful memories of his youth, of love lost and isolation chosen. But now the spirit led him to another scene from years ago, one that Scrooge had almost forgotten. It was a Christmas from many years past. Scrooge stood in the corner of the room, watching a younger version of himself sit alone at a desk, hunched over his work as though the holiday did not exist. The air was cold, the room dim, and there was no sign of celebration. The office, though simple and functional, felt hollow. Suddenly the door burst open, and a young boy rushed in. It was Fred, just a child at the time, his face flushed with excitement, and his arms full of wrapped gifts. "Uncle Scrooge!" young Fred exclaimed, his voice filled with the joy of the season. "Merry Christmas!" Scrooge's younger self looked up from his work, his face hard and uninterested. "What is all this nonsense?" he muttered, barely looking at Fred as he went back to his papers. "Christmas is a waste of time and money, boy." But young Fred, undeterred by his uncle's coldness, placed the gifts on the table and smiled. "I brought these for you, Uncle. I made them myself." His eyes shone with hope, believing that somehow this small gesture could melt the ice around Scrooge's heart. "I don't need your silly presents," the young Scrooge replied, his tone sharp. "Take them back." Fred's face fell for a moment, but he quickly recovered, his youthful optimism refusing to be crushed. "I'll leave them here, just in case you change your mind," he said softly, placing a hand on the desk. "Merry Christmas, Uncle. I'll see you tomorrow." As Fred left the room, the young Scrooge shook his head, muttering about the foolishness of Christmas. But the older Scrooge, standing beside the spirit, felt a pang of regret. He had been so focused on his work, on his pursuit of wealth, that he had pushed away the only family he had. And Fred, even as a child, had never stopped reaching out to him, full of love and hope that Scrooge would one day understand the joy of Christmas. The spirit turned to Scrooge, its voice gentle but firm. "Do you see, Ebenezer? Even as a boy, Fred reached out to you, but you pushed him away. His love for you has never wavered." Scrooge bowed his head, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. Fred had never given up on him, even when Scrooge had given up on himself. Fred's youthful hope reflects the faith and love that Christ offers to each of us, even when we turn away. As 1 Corinthians 13:7 reminds us, love always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Fred's love for his uncle mirrors the unconditional love that God extends to us, patiently waiting for us to open our hearts. Chapter 10. The Ghost of Christmas Present. Scrooge had seen the past, his lonely childhood, his lost love, and the life he could have had. But now the ghost of Christmas past was fading, its task complete. In its place, a new figure appeared. The ghost of Christmas present stood tall and imposing, draped in a green robe lined with white fur. A crown of holly adorned its head, and its presence radiated warmth and joy. "Come and know me better, man," the spirit boomed, its voice rich with life. Scrooge, though hesitant, was drawn to the spirit's energy. In an instant, they were transported to the bustling streets of Christmas morning. The air was crisp, and the city was alive with celebration. Families gathered, carolers sang, and joy filled the air. The spirit led Scrooge through the streets, showing him the beauty of the present moment, the joy that he had long shut out. But as they moved through the city, the spirit stopped at a modest home. It was the Cratchit household. Scrooge watched from the outside as Bob Cratchit and his family prepared for a small, humble meal. Despite their poverty, the room was filled with love. Tiny Tim, Bob's youngest son, sat in his father's lap, his frail body leaning into him. Scrooge noticed the boy's weakness, and for the first time he felt a pang of concern for someone outside himself. The spirit turned to Scrooge. "If these shadows remain unchanged, the child will die," the spirit said gravely. Scrooge's heart ached at the thought. He had never cared for the Cratchits before, but now, seeing their love in the face of hardship, he couldn't bear the thought of losing Tiny Tim. The Cratchits' joy in the midst of hardship reflects the true spirit of Christmas, a reminder that God's love and grace are not dependent on wealth or comfort. As 1 Timothy 6:6 teaches us, godliness with contentment is great gain. Scrooge, though surrounded by wealth, had never known the contentment he saw in the Cratchit home. Chapter 11. Christmas at the Cratchits. The spirit and Scrooge remained outside the Cratchit home for a moment longer, watching as the family gathered for their Christmas meal. Though the table was simple, the love that filled the room made it rich in every way that mattered. Bob Cratchit carved the small goose, his face beaming with pride as he served his family. His wife, though dressed in worn clothes, smiled warmly at their children. The older Cratchit children exchanged small gifts they had managed to prepare for one another, and at the centre of it all was Tiny Tim, his small frame wrapped in a blanket, but his face bright with joy. Bob sat him carefully at the table, his eyes filled with gratitude for the precious time they had together. Bob bowed his head, offering a prayer. "God bless this food, and may he keep us all, especially our Tiny Tim," Bob said softly. After the prayer, Tiny Tim, leaning into his father's embrace, whispered, "God bless us, everyone." Scrooge's eyes filled with tears as he watched this humble scene unfold. The Cratchits had so little in material wealth, but their hearts were filled with love and gratitude. Scrooge had spent his entire life chasing after riches, yet here in this small home he saw a richness of spirit he had never known. The spirit turned to Scrooge, its voice gentle. "Do you see, Ebenezer? They have far less than you, yet their hearts are full. And what of the boy? Do you see him?" Scrooge's gaze lingered on Tiny Tim, and for the first time in his life he felt true compassion for someone else's suffering. He knew then that he could no longer live the way he had been living. This moment of awakening for Scrooge is a powerful reminder that true wealth is not found in money, but in love and family. As James 1:27 teaches us, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress. Scrooge's heart, once hardened, begins to soften as he sees the true meaning of Christmas. Chapter 12. Fred's faith in Scrooge. After the Cratchit household faded from view, the spirit led Scrooge to another home. This time, it was the warm, inviting home of Fred, Scrooge's nephew. Inside, Fred's Christmas party was in full swing, filled with laughter and music. Fred stood at the centre of the room, telling a story that had everyone laughing. Even though Scrooge had scorned him and refused his invitations, Fred's heart remained open, full of joy and goodwill. "Uncle Scrooge, God bless him," Fred said with a chuckle. "He calls Christmas a humbug, but I feel sorry for him. He misses out on all this, on the love and joy of the season." Fred's guests laughed, but there was no malice in Fred's words. "There's still hope for him," Fred continued. "I believe that deep down there's good in him. Christmas is a time for hope after all." Scrooge stood silently, listening to Fred's words. Despite all the years of rejection, Fred still believed in him, still held out hope that he could change. Scrooge's heart ached at the thought. He had pushed Fred away for so long, but here, watching his nephew surrounded by love and joy, Scrooge began to see what he had lost. The spirit stood beside Scrooge, watching. "Do you see, Ebenezer? Even when you turned away, love remained. There is still hope for you." Fred's unwavering faith in Scrooge reflects the grace that God offers to each of us, even when we reject him. Just as Fred believed there was good in Scrooge, so too does Christ believe in us, offering grace and love, even when we don't deserve it. As 1 John 4:19 reminds us, we love because he first loved us. Chapter 13. Ignorance and Want. As the bright, joyful atmosphere of Fred's home faded, Scrooge found himself once again standing beside the ghost of Christmas present. But this time there was a heaviness in the air. The spirit's once vibrant face had grown solemn, and its glowing robe now appeared dimmer, as if weighed down by the scene they were about to witness. Without a word, the spirit led Scrooge to a darker part of the city. They moved through narrow, shadowed streets, where the sounds of joy and celebration could no longer be heard. Instead, they found themselves in a place of poverty and despair, where the people struggled just to survive. Then, from beneath the folds of the spirit's robe, two small, ragged children emerged. A boy and a girl, both gaunt and pale, their clothes tattered and their eyes wide with hunger. Scrooge recoiled at the sight, shocked by their frail and ghostly appearances. "Who are these children?" Scrooge asked, his voice trembling. The spirit's voice was filled with sorrow as it replied, "They are ignorance and want. Beware them both, but especially beware this boy, for on his brow I see the word doom." Scrooge stared at the children in horror, their faces etched with suffering. "Have they no refuge?" he asked, desperate for some kind of relief for these poor souls. "No one to care for them?" The spirit's reply came cold and sharp. "Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?" It echoed, repeating Scrooge's own heartless words from earlier that day. The weight of the spirit's rebuke hit Scrooge like a blow. He had once dismissed the suffering of the poor as someone else's problem. But now, standing before these children, these embodiments of society's neglect, he could no longer ignore the truth. Ignorance, the lack of knowledge and compassion, and want, the deep unmet needs of the world, were not abstract ideas. They were real, living tragedies. And Scrooge had been part of the problem. Ignorance and want serve as stark reminders of the consequences of indifference. When we turn a blind eye to the needs of others, we allow suffering to grow unchecked. As James 2:15-16 teaches, "Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, keep warm and well fed,' but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it?" Scrooge had lived this indifference, but now he stood face to face with its bitter fruit. Would he continue to shut his ears to the cry of the poor, or would he act? Chapter 14. The Ghost of Christmas, Yet to Come. As the ghost of Christmas present faded from sight, Scrooge found himself once again standing alone in the darkness. But this time, a new presence approached, one far more ominous and silent. The ghost of Christmas yet to come emerged from the shadows, draped in a long black robe, its face hidden beneath the hood. There was no light, no warmth, only the cold, unsettling stillness of what was yet to come. Scrooge trembled as the spirit stood before him, motionless, pointing ahead with a long, bony finger. Though the spirit did not speak, its message was clear. Scrooge was about to witness the future that awaited him if nothing changed. Without a word, Scrooge followed the ghost into the heart of the city. The streets were eerily quiet as they passed a group of men standing on the corner, speaking in hushed tones. Scrooge strained to hear what they were saying. "Old Scratch is dead," one man said with a shrug, as if the news meant nothing to him. "What's he left behind?" another asked, indifferent. A fortune, no doubt, but no one to mourn him. The men chuckled, and Scrooge's heart sank. Who were they speaking of? The spirit said nothing, only pointed forward. The scene shifted, and now Scrooge found himself standing in a shabby room where a woman rifled through the belongings of the deceased. She tossed aside a few trinkets, muttering under her breath. "He won't need these where he's gone," she said coldly, showing no sign of grief. Scrooge's chest tightened. He had seen enough. "Spirit, who is this man they speak of?" he asked, his voice shaky. But the spirit remained silent, its hand still pointing ahead. It led Scrooge to a lonely, overgrown graveyard. There, in the shadows, Scrooge saw a single headstone, neglected and forgotten. Slowly, trembling, he knelt before it and brushed away the dirt to reveal the name, Ebenezer Scrooge. "No!" Scrooge cried, falling to his knees. "Spirit, is this what must be, or what might be? Can this future be changed?" The spirit did not answer, but Scrooge's heart pounded with fear. He had lived his life for wealth, believing it would protect him, but now he saw the truth. His wealth had bought him nothing but a lonely, unmourned death. For the first time, Scrooge felt the weight of his choices in a way that could no longer be ignored. He had built his life on the pursuit of wealth, but now, standing before his own grave, the emptiness of that pursuit became painfully clear. Just as people are destined to die once, and after that to face judgment, Scripture teaches, Hebrews 9:27, and Scrooge stood on the edge of that destiny. The grave before him was not just a symbol of death, but of the consequences of a life lived for self. But even in this moment of dread, grace lingered on the edges, if he would only grasp it. Chapter 15. Scrooge's Plea for Change. Scrooge knelt before his own grave, trembling with fear. The cold stone before him seemed to mock the life he had lived, empty, loveless, and now forgotten. The ghost of Christmas yet to come loomed silently over him, its bony finger still pointing toward the headstone that bore his name. The weight of his past and the grim reality of his future settled heavily on Scrooge's shoulders. "Spirit!" Scrooge cried, his voice filled with desperation. "Is this the future that must be, or only what might be? Tell me that these shadows can be changed, that I may yet escape this fate." The ghost remained silent, unmoving, its dark figure like a shadow of death itself. Scrooge, overwhelmed by the horror of his possible end, wept bitterly, falling to the ground in despair. "I am not the man I was," Scrooge pleaded. "I will change. I will honor Christmas in my heart and keep it all year long. I will live differently. Please, Spirit, show me that I am not beyond hope." Scrooge's words hung in the air, echoing in the stillness of the graveyard. For a moment, the weight of his past choices threatened to crush him. He had lived his entire life pursuing wealth, shutting out love, and isolating himself from others. Now, as he stood on the brink of eternity, he realized how empty that life had been. But as Scrooge fell to his knees, begging for another chance, something began to shift. The ghost's figure grew fainter, and the scene around Scrooge blurred as if it were dissolving into the mist. The darkness that had surrounded him seemed to lift, and in its place there was the faintest glimmer of hope. "I will change," Scrooge whispered, his heart resolute. "I will not live as I have lived." And with that declaration the ghost disappeared, leaving Scrooge alone in the silence of the graveyard. This moment of Scrooge's journey is a powerful reminder of the gift of redemption. Though he stood before the grave, facing the consequences of his selfish life, there was still hope for change. It echoes the promise found in 2 Peter 3:9, "The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance." Scrooge's cry for transformation shows us that no matter how far we have wandered, God's grace is always within reach. The future may be uncertain, but with repentance, change is always possible. Chapter 16. Scrooge's Joyful Awakening. With a sudden gasp, Scrooge awoke. He was back in his own bed, in his own room, surrounded by the familiar, cold walls that had always seemed to reflect his own heart. But now something was different. The weight of the darkness and dread he had felt was gone, replaced by something Scrooge had not experienced in years: joy. The light of the morning sun streamed through the curtains, filling the room with warmth. Scrooge sat up in bed, his heart pounding, not with fear, but with excitement. "I'm alive," Scrooge exclaimed, his voice trembling with wonder. "It's not too late. I've been given another chance." Leaping out of bed, Scrooge rushed to the window and threw it open. The cold air hit his face, but he didn't mind. The world outside sparkled with the freshness of a new day, and for the first time in a long time, Scrooge felt truly alive. He called out to a boy passing by on the street. "What day is it, my fine fellow?" he asked, barely able to contain his excitement. The boy looked up, surprised by the old man's sudden cheerfulness. "Why, it's Christmas Day, sir." Scrooge laughed, the sound bubbling up from a place deep within him. "Christmas Day! Then the spirits have done it all in one night," he exclaimed, clapping his hands together in delight. "I haven't missed it. I still have time." Overcome with gratitude, Scrooge knew what he had to do. He had been given a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. He quickly ordered the largest turkey from the butcher and had it delivered to the Cratchit household. It was the first of many acts of kindness that Scrooge would perform that day. As Scrooge dressed, preparing to venture out into the bustling streets of London, he marvelled at the change in his heart. He no longer felt the heavy chains of greed or the suffocating weight of selfishness. Instead, his heart was light, filled with a joy that overflowed into every corner of his life. Scrooge's joyful awakening represents the moment of true redemption, a heart set free from the bondage of the past. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come, the old has gone, the new is here. 2 Corinthians 5:17. Scrooge had been transformed, not only by the realization of his errors, but by the grace extended to him, a grace that promises new life to all who receive it. Chapter 17. Scrooge's Generosity. The streets of London were alive with the sights and sounds of Christmas. Children darted between vendors, their laughter mixing with the ringing of church bells and the murmur of families heading home with their festive fare. But none seemed to embody the spirit of the day quite like Ebenezer Scrooge. The man who had once walked these same streets with his head down, avoiding all contact, now strolled through the city with a lightness in his step and a twinkle in his eye. Every face he passed, he greeted with warmth. "Merry Christmas!" he exclaimed to one and all, leaving onlookers surprised and delighted by his transformation. As he passed a group of charity workers, the same ones he had dismissed only the day before, Scrooge stopped and reached into his pocket, pulling out a generous sum. "I apologize for my behavior yesterday," he said, his voice kind and sincere. "Here, please take this, and let it be used to help those in need this Christmas." The workers stared in disbelief, but their hearts were warmed by the unexpected gesture. Scrooge's reputation had been one of a miser, a man who cared for nothing but his own wealth. But today it was as if a new man walked in his shoes, one whose wealth was now measured by kindness and generosity. From there, Scrooge made his way to the Cratchit home. His heart swelled with excitement at the thought of seeing their faces when they received the large turkey he had sent. As he approached their modest door, he knocked gently, waiting eagerly for an answer. Bob Cratchit opened the door, his face still lined with the weariness of work and worry, but brightened by the joy of Christmas. "Mr. Scrooge!" he exclaimed, surprised to see his employer on this day. "Indeed, Bob," Scrooge replied with a warm smile. "I've come to wish you and your family a very Merry Christmas. And, Bob, there's something more. I've decided to raise your salary and assist your family in whatever way I can. We'll see to it that Tiny Tim receives the care he needs." Bob stood speechless, his eyes welling with tears. "Mr. Scrooge, I don't know what to say." "Say nothing," Scrooge replied, placing a hand on Bob's shoulder. "Let's celebrate Christmas together. We have much to be thankful for." The sight of Scrooge's newfound generosity brings to mind the words of 2 Corinthians 9:7. "Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver." Scrooge's transformation had made him a cheerful giver, no longer chained by greed, but freed by love. His heart, once cold and closed, now overflowed with the desire to bless others. This is the true spirit of Christmas, the joy of giving that reflects the heart of God. Chapter 18. A Changed Man. The Christmas day that began with Ebenezer Scrooge's awakening had transformed not only him, but the lives of those around him. The ripple effect of his newfound generosity and kindness spread throughout the city, leaving astonishment in its wake. It was as though a cloud had lifted, and the light of Scrooge's renewed spirit shone brightly for all to see. As the days turned into weeks and months, Scrooge's transformation was not a fleeting one. The man who once grumbled at Christmas, who scorned charity and shunned joy, now lived with an open heart. He embraced the beauty of each day, not just during the Christmas season, but throughout the year. He became a second father to Tiny Tim, ensuring the boy received the medical care he needed. The Cratchit family, once burdened by their humble means, now flourished under Scrooge's care and support. And though Scrooge had once been a distant, detached employer, he now knew the importance of relationships. The joy he found in seeing Tiny Tim grow stronger and happier brought tears to his eyes, a reminder of the life he had almost missed. But Scrooge's transformation extended beyond his relationship with the Cratchits. The entire city of London felt the impact of his change. He became known as a man of kindness, one who gave freely to those in need. The charity workers who had once met his cold refusal were now welcomed with open arms, and their cause was championed by Scrooge himself. As Christmas approached each year, Scrooge's joy only grew. He celebrated the season with a heart full of gratitude, spending it with the Cratchit family and his nephew Fred. No longer was he the man who scoffed at invitations to Christmas dinner. Instead, he welcomed them with open arms, delighting in the fellowship and love he had once rejected. In the laughter of children, the warmth of family gatherings, and the quiet moments of reflection, Scrooge found the true meaning of Christmas. It wasn't found in wealth or in hoarding what one had, but in the joy of giving, the beauty of connection, and the grace of second chances. Scrooge's transformation reminds us of the truth found in Acts 20:35. It is more blessed to give than to receive. His life, once defined by taking and hoarding, was now filled with the joy of giving and serving others. Scrooge's redemption reflects the ultimate message of Christmas, Christ's coming into the world to offer us grace and a second chance at life. It's a reminder to us all that it's never too late to open our hearts and embrace the beauty of generosity and love. Chapter 19. Scrooge's Legacy of Love. As the years passed, Ebenezer Scrooge's transformation grew deeper. The man once known for his stinginess and cold heart had become the very embodiment of kindness, generosity, and love. Scrooge's name, which had been spoken with bitterness, was now a symbol of joy throughout London. Scrooge had not only changed himself, he had changed the lives of those around him. Tiny Tim, once frail and sickly, had grown strong under Scrooge's care. The boy's health improved as Scrooge ensured that he had everything he needed. More than material things, though, Scrooge became a second father to Tiny Tim, filling his life with love, attention, and hope. The Cratchit family, who had once struggled with financial hardship, now thrived. Under Scrooge's generous support, they were free to live without the worry of basic survival. Bob Cratchit, once a mere clerk in Scrooge's eyes, had become a friend and valued partner. The Cratchit home, once filled with quiet struggle, now overflowed with laughter and warmth. But Scrooge's generosity extended beyond the Cratchits. All of London began to feel the ripple effects of his newfound kindness. Those who had once feared or despised him now welcomed him with open arms. Scrooge became a friend to many, known for his generosity to the poor and his willingness to help those in need. As Christmas approached each year, Scrooge's joy only grew. He spent each holiday surrounded by the people he loved, Fred, Bob, and their families. No longer did he turn away from the warmth of family gatherings. Instead, he embraced them fully. Christmas dinner at Fred's home became a tradition, one filled with laughter, music, and love. In his later years, Scrooge's heart remained as joyful as it had on the morning of his transformation. His wealth was no longer a source of pride or fear. It was simply a tool he used to bless others. Scrooge's life had become a living testament to the power of redemption. The legacy that Scrooge left behind was one of love, generosity, and grace. He had once lived a life focused on wealth and self-preservation, but now he lived for others. His transformation reminds us of 2 Corinthians 5:17. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old has gone, the new is here. Scrooge's life is a beautiful picture of what happens when a heart is truly changed by grace. His story reminds us that it's never too late to become the person God intends us to be. Chapter 20. A Life Redeemed. Ebenezer Scrooge had become a man redeemed. His life, once marked by selfishness and isolation, was now a story of love, generosity, and joy. The transformation that had begun that Christmas Eve so many years ago had only deepened with time. Scrooge's life was filled with purpose, and he embraced each day with gratitude. As Scrooge grew older, he found peace in knowing that his life had not been wasted. He had once feared a lonely, unmourned death, but now he knew that he would leave behind a legacy of love and kindness. Scrooge's relationships with the Cratchit family and his nephew Fred had flourished. Christmases were now spent surrounded by laughter, warmth, and the people he loved. The joy that Scrooge found in his new life was not just for a season. It was a lasting joy, rooted in the deep satisfaction that comes from living for others. Scrooge had learned the truth that life's greatest riches are not found in money or possessions, but in relationships, love, and the gift of grace. When Scrooge's time on earth finally came to an end, he passed from this world with peace in his heart. There was no fear, no regret, only the quiet assurance that he had lived a life that mattered. Scrooge had been given a second chance, and he had embraced it fully. His funeral, once a scene of dread in the visions of the ghost of Christmas yet to come, was now a gathering of friends and family, all of whom mourned his passing but celebrated the life he had lived. His name, which had once been synonymous with cold-hearted greed, was now remembered with fondness and gratitude. Though Scrooge had left this world, the impact of his life remained. Tiny Tim, the Cratchits, Fred, and many others whose lives he had touched would continue to tell the story of Ebenezer Scrooge, a story not just of personal redemption, but of the power of grace and transformation. Scrooge's story is a reminder of the great truth found in Romans 12:2. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Scrooge's life had been transformed by the renewing power of love and grace. It is a story that reflects the heart of the gospel, that no matter how lost we may seem, we are never beyond the reach of God's redemptive grace. In the end, Ebenezer Scrooge's life became a testament to the truth that it is never too late to change. The Christmas story, the story of God's love and redemption, is a story for all of us. Just as Scrooge was given a second chance, we too are offered the gift of grace and the opportunity to live a life of love, generosity, and joy.